crystal chandeliers hung down from the high ceiling, their lights shattering into countless fragments like musical notes written in glass. The piano music rose, blending with the soft clinking of crystal glasses, echoing like the overture of an elegant performance. Laughter and conversation spread across the grand hall, so lively it felt as if the entire world had gathered here. But in the very center of it all, Adrian Blackwood sat still, silent like a misplaced low note in a song that was far too bright. 37 years old, once standing at the pinnacle of a financial empire, he now resembled nothing more than a shadow, adrift in the dazzling room. In front of him lay a white envelope edged in silver, small in size, yet its weight pressed against his chest like a stone. Adrian stared at it, then searched for excuses to avoid it, then longed for some miracle that would make it disappear. But the words remained, cold, neat, unyielding. Cordelia Hart cordially invites you to attend my special day. His chest tightened, his hand trembled. His pride was shredded, not by a sharp blade, quick and decisive, but by a dull one, cutting piece by piece. That pain would not kill instantly, yet it was enough to turn every breath into torture. Coldness seeped into his heart, drop by drop, like shards of glass embedding themselves deeper and deeper. Adrian once had everything, a brilliant career, deals that made the financial world bow its head. At his side was Cordelia, a beautiful, ambitious woman, once his fiancée. They had been the golden couple in the eyes of the elite, but in the span of a single autumn, everything collapsed. The company fell apart in a fraud scandal with no clear culprit. His fortune vanished, his honor crumbled, and Cordelia, instead of staying, turned her back, leaving behind one icy sentence: I cannot tie my life to a man who has nothing. From then on, Adrian withdrew like an outcast. He avoided parties, avoided prying eyes, and avoided whispers. He clung to what little dignity remained, like the final ashes of a dying flame. And now, that envelope, Cordelia's wedding invitation, appeared like a hammer blow. A hollow laugh escaped him, but inside it rang like breaking glass. What does Cordelia want for me to stand there, watching her walk beside another man, for me to be her spectacle, her joke, in the mirror hanging on the wall? He caught his own reflection, dark circles beneath his eyes, a gaunt face. The once proud image was reduced to ruins, yet within that gaze still flickered a small flame, the fire of a man who had never learned to bow his head. He looked, then searched, then longed, looked straight at the brutal truth, searched for a reason to rise again, longed for an anchor, a foothold, a lifeline to pull him from the abyss. A thought sparked in his mind: if I go alone, I will be a joke. But if I walk in with someone unexpected, different, what then? The idea rooted itself, sharp as glass, yet it kept him steady. Adrian closed the envelope, the rustle of paper sounding like armor snapping shut, his eyes lit with a cold gleam. He understood this decision was no mere matter of attending a wedding. This was war, a declaration of battle against Cordelia, against the past, against every person waiting for him to fall. The world around him blurred, the light, the music, the laughter, all swallowed by silence. Only the pounding of his heartbeat remained. Adrian inhaled deeply, feeling determination spread through him, hot and alive like blood returning to a heart once turned to stone. He whispered, as if only to himself, I will not lose. Not this time. And within that quiet vow, a new journey began. A journey that would lead him to a fateful encounter on the street with a homeless yet sharp-witted woman who would unexpectedly become his ally. Together, they would rip open the secrets hidden beneath the glittering facade of power and betrayal. The chandeliers still glimmered, the music still played, the laughter still rang out. But inside Adrian, another symphony had begun, slow, silent, yet destined to explode like a chorus that had not yet taken its final bow. That evening, Adrian sat in his old apartment downtown, the glow of streetlights scattering across the stained window. Outside, The city was still bustling, but inside the room, it echoed with emptiness. He slumped into the chair, the white envelope already hidden in the drawer, yet its presence weighed heavily on his mind. He closed his eyes, his thoughts cutting deep. If I go alone, I'll be a laughingstock. But if I go with someone, it will be different. The thought kept circling back, like a refrain refusing to stop. Logic told him to decline. Ignore the invitation. Stay home. Let Cordelia think whatever she wants. But his pride screamed, pushing him to step into that ballroom, to prove he hadn't collapsed completely. Pride and reason pulled against each other in his chest, like two forces dragging in opposite directions. Adrian shot up to his feet, pacing the room. Each step felt like dragging the weight of the past. If I go with an old friend, they'll only see me clinging. If I hire a model, what's the difference from a cheap joke? He muttered, his voice like he was arguing with himself. He stopped in front of the mirror. The reflection showed a gaunt face, but his eyes burned with fierce light. He exhaled sharply. No, I need to choose something no one expects. An entrance that will make Cordelia and everyone in that ballroom wonder who is that woman. That question clung to him, both a challenge and an opportunity. He recalled the whispers behind his back. Adrian is nothing but a shadow, unable to rise again. He saw it clearly. Cordelia's triumphant smile, the subtle mockery of high society. The image made his blood surge. He could not allow that script to unfold. He let out a faint laugh, but this time it wasn't hollow. It was the smile of a man ready to gamble. If Cordelia thinks I'll show up broken, she's mistaken. I'll make her the one unsettled. The idea took root, growing stronger, pulsing through him like a current. He didn't yet know who his companion would be, but it would not be the safe choice. He wanted a surprise. He needed a presence that would make the entire crowd turn their heads, that would knock Cordelia off balance right on the stage she built for herself. In his mind, questions pounded like drum beats. What if I choose the right person? What if that person isn't just a companion, but a mirror reflecting the truth? Cordelia tries to hide. Adrian clenched his fists, imagining himself walking into the grand hall. The whispers, the probing eyes, the familiar faces, all of it converging on him. But this time, he would not be alone. He drew a deep breath, like someone finally breaking the surface after being submerged too long. Fear lingered. Doubt circled. But willpower had won. He had decided. He would go. And he would go with someone capable of silencing the room for a few beats. The thought lit up inside him like a lamp switched on in the dark. From this moment on, Adrian was no longer the man staring helplessly at an envelope. He had turned his pain into resolve, his wound into a weapon. Outside, the city lights still glimmered. The hum of cars and voices blended together, reminding him that life would not wait. Adrian leaned against the window frame, looking down at the crowded streets. Within him, a new purpose had formed. Clear, daring, irreversible. He whispered, his voice steady. If I have to go, I'll go in a way no one expects. That night, Adrian stayed by the window for a long time, the streetlight spilling over his face. The pain was still there, but it had changed color. It was not humiliation anymore, but defiance. He didn't yet know how fate would unfold, didn't know in what form that companion would appear, but he could feel it somewhere out there. The answer awaited him. And that encounter, accidental yet inevitable, would alter the entire story. The next morning, Adrian wandered along the old street, the one he usually avoided since the day he lost everything. The row of luxury shops was still lit, suits displayed behind the gleaming glass, shoes polished so bright they could reflect an entire face. That used to be his world, but now it was only a distorted mirror reflecting his loss. He stopped in front of a small cafe, its walls stained with faded paint. On the steps, a woman sat huddled, clutching a worn-out coat at the shoulders. Her hair was tangled, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion, her appearance rough as if the whole city had forgotten her. Yet something in her gaze made Adrian pause. Those eyes were bright, alert, as though behind the ashes still burned a fire that refused to die. He slowed his steps. The woman lifted her head, her voice hoarse but firm. "You're looking at me like I'm some kind of experiment." Adrian looked momentarily unsettled, then let out a faint laugh. "Maybe I'm just wondering why someone like you would be sitting here." She curved her lips into a thin smile, sharp as a blade. "Someone like me, meaning what, poor ragged, or simply someone who doesn't have a seat in that fancy hall across the street?" The questions cut like arrows, making Adrian draw back slightly. He realized he had accidentally brushed against her pride. He nodded softly, his voice slowing. "I only meant, maybe you don't belong on this sidewalk." She was silent for a few seconds, her eyes weighing, as if measuring the truth in every word he said. Then she shrugged. "This world has already decided where I belong. I don't have a choice anymore." But her tone wasn't entirely bitter. It sounded more like a shield. And in that pause, Adrian saw himself. He, too, had once been pushed aside by the world, his fate dictated by others. He sat down on the steps beside her, surprised by the naturalness of the gesture. "I need someone to stand with me, someone different enough to make the crowd turn their heads." She raised an eyebrow, her gaze skeptical. "And you think I'm that choice?" Adrian drew in a breath, his heart racing. He had never voiced this idea to anyone before. But now, facing this stranger, he felt he could take the risk. "I think, if you agree, we'll make them wonder." A laugh slipped from her lips, dry but ringing. "You're reckless. Taking someone like me to that extravagant wedding, aren't you afraid they'll laugh in your face?" "They've already been laughing," Adrian replied quickly, his voice steady. "But this time, I want them to laugh in confusion." She looked at him longer, her eyes trembling like water about to ripple. Then slowly, she spoke. "Fine, I'll go. But don't think I need saving." Her words fell into the silence, echoing like a gavel striking. Adrian smiled, nodding. "I don't want to save anyone. I want an ally." For the first time, a different light flickered in her eyes. Not defense, but curiosity. As if she couldn't believe she had just agreed with a stranger. In that moment, amidst the crowded street, an unspoken pact was formed. No papers, no handshake, only a glance and a few words. Yet it was enough to change the path of both lives. Adrian stood and reached out his hand. She hesitated, then placed her slender yet strong hand into his. In that instant, he knew he had found what he needed, an unexpected presence, a companion who would unsettle Cordelia, and above all, a mirror reflecting both the pain and pride still surviving within him. "I'm Adrian," he introduced himself, his voice low. "And I'm Evelyn," she answered, her eyes never leaving his. "But remember this, I'm not your puppet." A faint smile crossed Adrian's lips. He understood perfectly. This wasn't the beginning of some stage play. This was the beginning of a fragile alliance, full of contradictions, but also holding within it an unexpected strength. And so, amidst the street of light and shadow, they walked side by side. Neither knew what lay ahead, but both felt it clearly. Destiny had just written a new chapter. Adrian's small apartment was still lit late that night. On the table, old newspapers were scattered, dust streaks clinging to a photo frame face down. The space, once familiar with silence, now carried another presence. Evelyn. She sat in front of the mirror, her hair messy, falling over her shoulders, her face etched with the weariness of nights spent on the streets. But the look in the mirror was not fragile. It was sharp, as if daring the world to challenge her. Adrian stood behind, quietly watching. He didn't know how to begin. He only let out a simple sentence. "We'll need to make a change." Evelyn raised an eyebrow, the corner of her lips lifting into a half-mocking, half-curious smile. "Do you mean to turn me into a lady of high society?" Adrian nodded slightly. He didn't need to say more. His silence was the answer. A pause passed. Then Evelyn touched the mirror in front of her. Her fingertips slid across a small scratch on the glass, as if searching for another version of herself, blurred under layers of dust. Her voice was soft but resonant. I used to know this feeling. Sitting before a mirror, letting someone paint over me, fix me, drape me in a dazzling shell. But then I realized, nothing lasts. In the end, it's still yourself you have to face. Adrian was momentarily surprised. In her words, he heard the echo of a past tied to luxury, a piece of her life she tried to hide. He didn't ask further, because the calmness in her voice was like a warning. Don't dig deeper until I'm ready. She stood up, turned to face him. Fine. If you want that crowd to look twice, I'll help, but I won't pretend to be someone else. He smiled, nodded. To him, Evelyn didn't need to become a flawless lady. It was the contrast that made her striking. But to step into Cordelia's ballroom, she needed a shell sharp enough so no one could humiliate her. The next day, Adrian took her to a familiar clothing boutique. Rows of gowns shimmered under the lights, the scent of new fabric mingling with a faint trace of perfume. Evelyn paused at the entrance, her eyes both cautious and sardonic. This is the kind of place where someone like me is bound to be stared at. Adrian tilted his head, answered softly, then let them stare. But on our terms. At that moment, Evelyn stepped inside. The overhead lights poured over her face, highlighting features long shadowed by life's grit. A sales clerk approached, hesitated at her worn-out clothes, but Adrian's cold, steady gaze silenced him, leading Evelyn toward the evening gown section. Evelyn tried on dress after dress, deep red, then emerald green, then midnight black. Each time she stepped out, she seemed like a different version of herself, and each time she lingered at the mirror longer, as if searching beneath the silk for the true skin underneath. Her eyes didn't waver. Instead, they grew brighter, as though long-forgotten memories were awakening. In the end, she chose a simple black dress with clean lines, hugging her thin yet strong figure. Not a showy gown, but with every movement, the fabric glinted coldly, like a blade sheathed in refined elegance. Adrian looked at her, exhaling lightly. He knew he had just witnessed a rebirth. Evelyn didn't need painting over. She only needed the right mirror to reflect the part of herself that once belonged to that world. On the way home, Evelyn gently touched the shoulder of her new dress, whispering as if to herself, mirrors, lights, lines, all just masks. But this time, I'll choose to wear it. Adrian glanced at her, realizing that her voice no longer carried helplessness but determination. And he knew that when the two of them stepped into that ballroom, not just Cordelia, but everyone would stop and look again. The night of the ceremony had arrived. The ballroom of the five-star hotel glowed under the brilliance of chandeliers, their light pouring down like thousands of glittering arrows, illuminating every perfectly made-up face. Camera flashes went off without pause, and the sound of high heels striking the marble floor became the background score to this extravagant play. Guests lined up to walk down the red carpet, their whispers, laughter, and scrutinizing gazes weaving into an invisible net that covered the entire hall. And then, the doors opened. Adrian Blackwood strode in, tall and lean but steady, his gaze straight and calm. Beside him, Evelyn, in a sharp black dress, walked with a grace that required no effort. Not dazzling in the familiar way of high society, but she carried something elusive and unexpected confidence, an opposition that dared every pair of eyes. A wave of murmurs instantly rippled across the hall. Who is that I've never seen her in this circle? Who does she think she is? Walking alongside Adrian camera, flashes fired continuously, desperate to capture the moment. Evelyn lifted her chin slightly, refusing to avoid a single gaze. Her eyes were bright, but not gentle. They reflected the curiosity of the crowd back onto them, forcing them to hold back. Cordelia Hart, in her resplendent white wedding gown, faltered briefly when she saw them. The smile on her lips shifted, just for an instant, but it was enough for Adrian to notice. And in that instant, He knew the plan had taken its first successful step. The atmosphere in the hall seemed to pause for a few beats. Their appearance was like a pebble thrown into a still lake, sending ripples outward, touching every glance, every breath. Whispers followed one after another, creating a wave of speculation that could not be silenced. Adrian kept his face calm, but inside his chest, his heart pounded like war drums. He glanced at Evelyn. She walked with steady steps, her lips curving into a defiant smile. It wasn't a smile meant to charm, but the smile of someone who had stood in the shadows for too long and was no longer afraid of the light. They walked straight into the center of the ballroom. And at that moment, Adrian realized it wasn't just Cordelia. The entire hall had been thrown off balance. They didn't know who Evelyn was, couldn't define her, and that very ambiguity had turned into power. Evelyn leaned toward Adrian, whispering softly enough for only him to hear. "Do you see it? They're looking at us like they're trying to solve a mystery." Adrian gave a slight nod, his eyes meeting hers for a fleeting second. For the first time, he felt he was not alone. In that moment, the ballroom was no longer Cordelia's stage. It had become a new battleground. One Adrian and Evelyn had entered as challengers. This story up to this point must make you feel as tense as I do. Will Adrian and Evelyn's unexpected appearance be enough to turn the tide? And Cordelia, the one who once turned away so coldly, how will she react when faced with this truth, if this part resonates with your emotions? Leave a comment below. What do you think Evelyn is hiding? Do you believe that the right appearance at the right time can change the entire game? Don't forget to subscribe to The Soft Why and share this story with your friends. Every share and every comment from you is the motivation for us to continue bringing emotional journeys and stories that remind us that even in the darkest of times, people can still shine. The atmosphere in the banquet hall was still dazzling, but undercurrents had spread everywhere ever since Adrian and Evelyn walked in. Hidden glances darted their way, as if waiting for a play to unfold right in the middle of the celebration. Cordelia Hart, in her splendid white wedding gown, walked closer. Beside her was Richard Hale, the groom, a young rising businessman, his face glowing, yet his eyes betraying undeniable arrogance. The sound of Cordelia's heels tapped against the marble floor, each step cutting into the air like the slice of shears. Adrian kept his back straight, his eyes unblinking as Cordelia stopped in front of him. Evelyn stood right next to him, her face calm, her smile light and sharp as a thin blade. "Adrian," Cordelia spoke, her voice sweet like velvet covering the edge of a knife. "I didn't expect you to come, and with a companion." Evelyn tilted her head slightly, offering no reply. Her eyes swept over Cordelia, serene yet carrying a silent challenge. Adrian gave a faint smile. "Your invitation was hard to decline. I suspect you didn't send it merely to share your happiness." Cordelia paused for a moment, then quickly regained her composure. "You've always been suspicious. Either way, I still wish you to find new joy." The blessing sounded like a trap, soft yet razor sharp. Adrian caught the hidden mockery in every word. His chest ached, but this time he didn't look away. "You know, Cordelia," Adrian said slowly, "a person can lose everything, but there is one thing that isn't easily stolen, the ability to rise again." Richard gave a dismissive laugh, cutting in. "That's true, but only if that person still has the chance to rise. Some people, once they fall, never get back up." Adrian turned to him, his gaze icy. "I have fallen before, Richard, yet here I stand. As for you, can you truly say you've never been propped up by shady games?" The air around them thickened. Those nearby fell silent, ears straining to catch every word. Cordelia interjected, her voice low but barbed. "Adrian, you always think the world is against you. The truth is, you simply weren't enough to keep me." Evelyn spoke up, her tone steady and precise. "Sometimes, people don't leave because of a lack of material wealth. They leave because they're afraid of facing the truth." Cordelia stiffened, turning sharply toward Evelyn, her eyes flashing with irritation. "And who are you to interfere in this matter?" Evelyn met her gaze, her smile as sharp as a blade hidden in velvet. "I'm just an outsider, but sometimes outsiders see more clearly." A tense silence blanketed the room. Cordelia bit her lip lightly, and Richard tightened his hand at his side. Adrian remained quiet, letting the clash speak for itself. In that moment, he realized something: Evelyn was not just a facade to appear with. She was becoming a sharp dagger, ready to cut through the mask Cordelia was so desperate to wear. Cordelia took a deep breath, then forced a smile, as if to end the confrontation. "Either way, I still hope you enjoy the evening. Let's just call it a beautiful memory." With that, she turned, pulling Richard away. The sound of her gown sweeping across the marble floor echoed like receding waves, leaving behind a hollow silence. Adrian watched them go, his feelings tangled. The pain was still there, but for the first time, he felt he was no longer alone in facing it. Evelyn stood beside him, silent yet resolute, like an unspoken ally. The music in the banquet hall shifted into slower melodies. The violin lingered, each rising and falling note like gentle waves brushing against the walls of the heart. Under the warm golden lights, couples began to guide each other onto the dance floor. Dresses twirled, heels glided smoothly, the entire scene resembling a living classical painting. Adrian stood still for a moment. After the tense encounter with Cordelia and Richard, his chest still carried the heavy echo. But then his eyes found Evelyn. She stood nearby, quietly observing, her eyes reflecting the chandelier's glow. There was no confusion in them, only a calmness that was hard to read. Adrian reached out his hand slightly, his voice low and steady. "Care to dance?" Evelyn arched a brow, the corner of her lips curling faintly. "You think I know these steps. You don't need to. Just let me lead." She looked at him a beat longer, then placed her slender hand in his. That touch was not weak. It carried weight, determination. They stepped onto the floor. Adrian's steps guided, slow but sure. Evelyn followed, stiff at first, then gradually loosening. The music wrapped around them, turning each step into a shared breath. At that moment, Adrian suddenly realized he was no longer paying attention to the scrutinizing eyes around them. The entire hall seemed to recede, leaving only the sound of his own heartbeat and Evelyn's heels against the floor. Evelyn lifted her gaze, her eyes meeting his, her voice soft like a question. "You once belonged to this world, didn't you?" Adrian gave a slight nod. His eyes shadowed. "I did, but I lost it." She spun with his lead, the black gown sketching a sharp curve beneath the lights. "I'd say you didn't truly lose it. They stole it from you." The words rang in Adrian's ears, as though someone had touched the pain he kept hidden. His lips pressed together, his heart pounding. "And you?" he asked, his voice quiet but edged. "Where did you once belong?" Evelyn's eyes darkened, then flickered with a faint, elusive light. "I once had a place, but that world didn't accept me. So I learned to stand outside." The two stayed silent for a few beats, letting the violin fill the space. Their steps continued, light but firm, as though every movement was an exploration. It was as if the waltz were not just for dancing, but for uncovering each other's hidden corners. Adrian felt the distance between them shrink, not the physical space, but the distance between two people who had once been left on the margins, now accidentally finding each other in the light. He spoke softly, almost like a confession. "I don't know if I can trust again." Evelyn replied immediately, her voice steady but not rigid. "Neither do I." That brief statement, firm yet weary, made Adrian's heart sink. In the midst of the dance, they exchanged no promises, only an acknowledgement. But sometimes acknowledgement alone is enough for two souls to touch. The music slowly faded. Adrian guided Evelyn toward the edge of the floor. He lowered his head slightly, his hand still holding hers longer than necessary. Evelyn withdrew her hand, her eyes meeting his, not quite soft, but no longer distant. At that moment, Adrian understood that Evelyn was not merely the companion he had sought to save face. She was becoming a mirror turned back on him, exposing his fragility, yet at the same time awakening a different kind of strength. The music came to an end, and the guests returned to their tables. Trays of red wine sparkled under the chandeliers, the soft clink of glass against glass echoing like background music. The atmosphere seemed calm, but Adrian knew every gaze was still fixed on him and Evelyn. They sat down at a table near the center, a spot impossible to escape the eyes of the entire hall. A few familiar faces from the financial world gave slight nods of greeting, but their eyes held more curiosity than respect. Evelyn remained composed, her hands lightly resting on the glass of wine, her demeanor calm as if she was long accustomed to being scrutinized. A group of guests approached. Among them was Maxwell Grant, head of an investment fund, who had once partnered with Adrian before everything collapsed. He curled his lips into a smile, his voice carrying loud enough for everyone to hear Adrian Blackwood. "It's been a while. I'm surprised you still have enough courage to show up." Adrian returned a faint smile, his voice steady. "Maxwell, surprise is just another way of admitting something. Perhaps you're surprised I haven't disappeared." A few laughs broke out, half genuine, half mocking. Maxwell hadn't replied yet when Evelyn spoke, her voice calm and sharp. "Disappearing isn't always a failure. Sometimes it's how people prepare to return stronger." The table fell silent for a moment. Eyes turned toward Evelyn in surprise. An unknown woman, dressed elegantly but unfamiliar, had managed to cut into the conversation as if she belonged entirely in this world. Another guest, Mrs. Marianne Foster, a veteran businesswoman, let out a cold laugh and asked pointedly, "And who are you?" Evelyn gently swirled the wine in her glass, her voice low but clear. "Just someone who has seen many fall because they believe themselves invincible." The answer made Marianne falter, while those around half smiled, half observed. Adrian noticed Evelyn's gaze did not waver. She commanded the space with an icy confidence, like a hidden piece just placed on the board. The conversation shifted. A guest brought up the financial market and its recent turbulence. Adrian had not yet spoken when Evelyn's voice cut in, steady like someone who knew the game. "Real value isn't in the numbers that dance every day, but in the trust the marketplace has in the people behind them. When trust breaks, all the figures are nothing but illusions." Her words drew a few seconds of silence before Maxwell let out a short laugh. "You speak like a seasoned investor," Evelyn replied with a thin smile. "I only observe, and I've learned that trust is the strongest currency of all." The atmosphere turned. Those nearby began to nod, their eyes shifting from skepticism to interest. Adrian looked around, clearly seeing the picture transform from being mocked as the fallen man. He was now eclipsed by Evelyn, who had taken center stage. Pride surged within Adrian, yet mixed with a trace of hidden jealousy. He used to be the one leading these conversations, the one commanding all eyes. Now, the woman who had once stepped out from the streets was the one drawing the spotlight. Evelyn tilted her head slightly, as if she knew what he was thinking. Her voice softened, yet still sharp enough for the whole table to hear. "In the end, true value isn't about where we fell, but how we rise. That is what they should remember." Her words rang like an exclamation mark closing the dialogue. The eyes around the table shifted, and a few guests laughed in admiration. Maxwell narrowed his eyes but offered no rebuttal. Adrian drew in a deep breath, his chest burning. He had just realized something clear. Evelyn was not merely a companion. She was shaping the entire narrative of the room, and in that brilliance, he saw the game had changed. The music in the banquet hall continued, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses carrying on as if nothing had changed. But Adrian could clearly feel it. The atmosphere around him had shifted the moment Evelyn spoke. Many curious, even admiring, eyes turned toward them. And that was exactly what made Cordelia unable to sit still. Moments later, Adrian realized he was being drawn out of the circle of conversation. A gentle hand touched his shoulder. When he turned, Cordelia was standing there, Her smile was still sweet, but her eyes gleamed with tension. "Can we talk in private for a moment?" she asked, her voice framed as a suggestion, but laced with command. Adrian glanced at Evelyn. She gave a slight nod, her calm gaze silently telling him, "Go, but don't forget I'm still here." He followed Cordelia out to the balcony. The glass door closed behind them, shutting out the lively noise. Outside, the air was colder, the night wind sweeping through, carrying the fragrance of jasmine from the garden below. Cordelia turned back, her smile fading. "What are you doing?" "Adrian. Bringing a woman. No one knows where she came from. Walking into my wedding." Adrian folded his arms, his eyes steady. "You invited me. Cordelia. You probably expected me to come alone, defeated, so you could compare and feel victorious. But unfortunately, you guessed wrong." Cordelia drew in a deep breath, her voice softening but sharp as a blade. "Don't you understand people are talking? Not about me, but about you, about what you're still trying to hold on to." Adrian let out a faint laugh. "If they're talking, at least it means they looked at me one more time." "That's enough." Cordelia gripped the balcony railing tightly, her voice rising. "You're always like this, always resisting, always needing to prove something. You refuse to accept that this game is already over." Adrian stepped closer, his tone firm. "The game never ended. Cordelia, you just chose to leave the table while the cards were still in play." In that moment, the space between them cracked open like an explosion. In Cordelia's eyes, anger mixed with confusion. She clenched her teeth, spitting out her words. "You brought her here. For what? To challenge me?" Adrian didn't flinch. His answer was direct. "No, I brought her here to remind you that I'm still standing. And I'm not a puppet in the play you've written." A tense silence fell. Only the sound of the wind whistling through the door remained. Cordelia stared at him, her gaze stripped of proud confidence, flickering with fear. "You've changed," she whispered, almost trembling. "You never used to look me straight in the eye like this." Adrian said nothing. He simply turned, opened the glass door, and walked back into the light of the hall. Cordelia stayed behind on the balcony, her face hidden in the shadows, lips pressed tight as if holding back words she dared not speak. Inside, Adrian found Evelyn's eyes. She was still there, his quiet anchor, and he knew this clash of power had only just begun. Adrian returned to the banquet hall, the atmosphere seemingly unchanged. The soft music, the gentle clinking of wine glasses, the steady flow of toasts and laughter. But for him, everything was different. The private encounter on the balcony with Cordelia still echoed in his heart, like a crack that had yet to close. He had barely sat down when Richard Hale approached. The groom still looked polished, his smile broad and dazzling. But in his eyes was a sharp glint, like a hidden blade sheathed in velvet. He stopped right beside Adrian and Evelyn's table, lowering his voice just enough for only the two of them to hear. "Adrian," Richard said, emphasizing each word, "who is the woman with you?" Adrian looked up, his gaze steady. "Why do you care?" Richard tilted his head, his smile unchanging. "Because I know very well that no one shows up here by coincidence, especially not someone who doesn't belong to this world." Evelyn set her glass down, her eyes unwavering. "Isn't this world full of people draped in a glamorous shell just to hide the rot beneath?" Richard paused for a beat, then chuckled, his voice low. Sharp words, but reckless too. "Be careful. One day that recklessness may swallow you both whole." Adrian held his gaze, his voice firm. "I've been swallowed before, Richard, but you know, some sink and never rise, and others sink only to learn how to swim." Richard leaned closer, his words dropping into a warning. "Don't think her presence beside you is salvation. Perhaps her very existence will only dig up the past, and that past is not something everyone wants dragged into the light." With that, Richard straightened up, his radiant smile returning as if no threat had just been spoken. He stepped away, melting into the crowd, leaving behind a dense heaviness at the table. Adrian glanced at Evelyn. She remained silent, her face composed. Yet in her eyes flickered a trace of vigilance. They both understood Richard hadn't spoken just to frighten them. Behind his warning lay an entire game waiting to unfold. Adrian drew a deep breath. The darkness beyond the balcony faintly reflected in his eyes, while inside, the crystal lights still blazed brightly. Two opposing shades, as if foretelling the storm that was about to break. By now, surely you can feel Adrian's heartbeat racing. What is Richard hiding? Why did he stress that Evelyn's presence wasn't accidental? And what truth from the past is about to be unearthed? If you have thoughts, leave a comment below. Share with us, do you believe Evelyn is a savior or a ticking spark? Don't forget to subscribe to The Soft Why and share this story with your friends. We believe that sometimes vague warnings are the very key that unlocks a greater truth. Not long after the encounter with Richard, Adrian and Evelyn quietly left the main hall, seeking a more secluded corner of the hotel. The air there was calmer, with only distant music and dim light spilling from the hallway. Adrian leaned against the wall, his heart heavy. Richard's warning echoed in his head. Her presence will only drag your past back into the light. He turned toward Evelyn, ready to speak, but she was one step ahead. You deserve to know. Her voice was hoarse yet firm. I didn't just stumble into your life. Adrian froze, his heartbeat stumbling. Evelyn took a deep breath, her eyes fierce but tinged with pain. I was a witness to the fraud that year. The scandal that cost you your company, your honor, and your engagement. The space froze solid. Adrian felt the blood drain from his face. Memories he thought long buried rushed back, the irregular numbers in the reports, the contracts signed in haste, the tense board meetings before everything collapsed. And now, Evelyn's confession fell into place like the final missing piece. So, he whispered, his voice catching, you were there. Evelyn nodded slowly, her gaze locked on him. I saw everything. I knew who was behind it, but I couldn't speak. Back then, I was just a low-level employee. My words meant nothing, and when I tried to bring evidence outside, I was threatened and forced to abandon everything. I disappeared, until today. Adrian pressed a hand to his forehead, shame and anger twisting inside him. Questions pounded in his mind. Why hadn't she come forward sooner? Why let him live in disgrace for so long? Yet he also understood the truth. She, too, had been a victim. He looked straight at Evelyn, his voice unsteady but resolute. Do you still have proof? Evelyn pulled a worn folder from her small handbag. Inside were copies of emails, contracts, and altered meeting minutes. Each page was like a blade cutting deeper into Adrian's memory. These are what I managed to keep when I ran, she said slowly. I always knew one day I would have to return, not to save you, but to save myself. Adrian sat silent. The pain spread through his chest like ink seeping into water. But at the same time, another feeling rose. Hope. For the first time in years, he saw a path to reclaim his honor. He gave a slight nod, his eyes meeting hers. So this is the reason fate put us on the same board. Evelyn's lips curved into a thin smile, not of joy, but of resolve. There's no turning back now. Adrian, either we expose the truth, or we keep living in the dark. Adrian drew a deep breath, his long, battered pride flaring back to life. He knew the truth wasn't just for justice for himself, but also for the woman before him, the one who had borne her suffering in silence all these years. In that moment, he understood the past and the present had bound them together as one. The hallway was silent, with only faint music drifting from the ballroom, distant like an echo from another world. Adrian and Evelyn stood facing each other. Between them, the old stack of documents that had just revealed the truth. Those fragile sheets of paper weighed heavily than a verdict. Adrian clenched his fists, his eyes locked on Evelyn. In his gaze, she was no longer just the homeless woman he had happened to bring to the wedding. Standing before him now was a witness, Someone carrying the final missing piece of his life's tragedy. His voice was low but full of emotion. You could have stayed silent forever. You could have let me drown in defeat. Why choose to appear now? Evelyn did not avoid his stare. She drew a deep breath, her shoulders trembling slightly, but her tone remained firm. Because I'm too tired of running. I once told myself, I don't need anyone to save me. But the truth is, I cannot live in the shadows forever, carrying a secret no one believes. When I saw you out on the street, I knew it was time. Adrian listened, his chest tightening. Her words were not only a confession, but also a call for understanding. He realized that although their paths were different, the wounds they carried came from the same source: betrayal, being stripped of their voices. He took a step forward, his tone slow yet steady. From now on, I will no longer be alone. Evelyn looked at him, her eyes softening. The constant wariness in her gaze faded, giving way to something else, a flicker of trust, fragile but real. She smiled faintly and repeated softly, no more alone, but I don't need anyone to save me. Adrian nodded, a faint smile breaking through his hardened face. I don't intend to save. I intend to fight alongside you. In that moment, the distance between them closed. No handshake, no grand oath, only their eyes meeting enough to seal an alliance. An alliance not built on pity, but on shared pain and a common goal to expose the truth. Outside, the night wind slipped through the cracks of the door, carrying the faint scent of jasmine. It felt like a signal of change. Both of them stayed quiet for a few beats, letting the heaviness inside slowly dissolve into determination. Adrian continued, his voice low but resonant like a vow. We have the evidence. We have the memories. And now, we have each other. No one can silence us again. Evelyn nodded. For the first time, her eyes glimmered with relief, as if the burden of all those years had finally found a shoulder to share. The noise from the ballroom grew louder, reminding them that their enemies were still waiting just beyond that door. But this time, they would not step in as two lost souls. They would walk in as a pair, carrying the truth in their hands. At that moment, both Adrian and Evelyn understood that the past may have cut them off from the world, but the present was binding them together, like two broken fragments finding each other in the ocean of night. Dawn had just broken, and the city blazed with the rush of traffic. But for Adrian, that morning was not light. It was blades. When he unlocked his phone, the screen flooded with tabloid headlines. Adrian Blackwood returns with a mysterious beauty, is the bankrupt man seeking to reclaim the spotlight. Who is the stranger beside Adrian, a shady past waiting to be exposed? From the peak of finance to society's mockery, has Adrian truly changed? Every word was like a slash across the pride that had only just begun to heal. Adrian gripped the phone, skimming through the venomous comments. Some mocked. Others speculated that Evelyn was a paid escort, and some even dragged up his old mistakes like an endless indictment. He shot up to his feet, pacing across the room. The once quiet apartment now echoed with the sharp taps of hurried footsteps, packed with fury. Evelyn sat across from him, her eyes following, neither alarmed nor evasive. They are killing my dignity piece by piece, Adrian growled, his voice cracking like shattering glass. Evelyn set her coffee cup down, her tone calm. No, they're just afraid. Adrian whipped around, his eyes darkening. Afraid they're slandering you, turning you into a joke. Evelyn tilted her head slightly, a faint smile crossing her lips. When they have to throw mud, it means they have no other weapons left. Rumors, the press, threats, the same three tricks to drag you down with them. As if to prove her point, a knock sounded at the door. Adrian opened it to find a white envelope left on the threshold. He tore it open. Inside was nothing but one scrawled line. If you know what's good for you, disappear. This isn't your place. His hand clenched the paper until it crumpled, his breath ragged, veins standing out on his wrist. Evelyn stepped forward, placing her thin but steady hand on his shoulder. Her voice was low, heavy, and unwavering. Don't give them the power to decide how you feel. If we waver, it means they've already won half the game. Adrian shut his eyes, drawing in a deep breath. Her words were the anchor holding him back from plunging headfirst into the abyss of rage. But the storm had not passed. His phone buzzed again. A new email flashed, its subject line blaring, "Exclusive gala invitation. Your chance to speak out." Adrian opened it. The content was brief, polished, the mark of a manipulative hand. If you want to reclaim your standing, show up. All answers await. He and Evelyn exchanged a look. Both understood this was not an invitation. This was a trap. Adrian collapsed into the chair, still holding his phone, his voice hoarse, frayed. "They want me to walk into the circle, just to drown me all over again." Evelyn did not blink, her voice cutting sharp yet steady. "Or, this is where we turn the board around." Silence blanketed the room. Outside, the city roared on, horns and hurried lives colliding. But inside, there was nothing but the sound of hearts pounding and eyes locked. Adrian lifted his gaze. In those eyes, once etched with defeat, now burned a steady flame. He nodded slowly, each word striking out, firm as steel. "Then we'll go, not to defend, but to end it." Evelyn gave a faint nod, the corner of her lips curling into a thin smile. Not the smile of recklessness, but of someone prepared. They both knew the media storm was only the prelude. The real confrontation was still waiting ahead, where the lights would shine brighter, the applause roar louder, and where the truth would have nowhere left to hide. The exclusive gala unfolded in the grand ballroom of the Grand Monarch Hotel. The chandelier lights blazed brilliantly, reflecting off the marble floor, turning the entire hall into a stage waiting for its great drama. The most powerful figures in finance, politics, and media were present. The air was both magnificent and suffocating, like a still lake hiding a storm beneath. Adrian and Evelyn walked in, quiet but confident. Whispers immediately arose like waves rippling across the room. After the media storm that morning, their appearance became the center of attention. At the center of the hall, Cordelia Hart stood alongside Richard Hale. Both shone under the lights as if they were standing on a winner's podium. Richard raised his glass to greet the guests, his voice echoing, "Thank you all for coming. Tonight, we celebrate a new beginning. Also, to affirm, truth always belongs to the strong." His eyes swept across to Adrian, his thin smile sharp as a blade. Adrian stepped forward a few paces, his voice low but carrying clearly. "Since we're speaking of truth, let's allow it to speak for itself." The hall fell utterly silent. Evelyn walked up beside him, placing a folder of documents on the long, white-clothed table. Every eye turned, waiting. Adrian opened the pages one by one, his voice firm. "This is a copy of the altered contract. This is the internal email showing collusion. And this," he lifted up a meeting record, the signature etched clearly, "is proof that Cordelia and Richard were involved in the fraud that destroyed my company." Whispers erupted like fire meeting oil. A few journalists immediately scribbled notes, cameras flashing wildly. Cordelia's face drained of color, but she forced a smile. "Adrian, are you fabricating stories again? Those papers could be made anywhere." Evelyn stepped forward, her voice sharp and clear. "I am a witness. I once worked in the records handling team. I was forced into silence, threatened to disappear, but I kept the originals." She pulled out another stack of files, slamming them onto the table. The space went still for a beat. Richard laughed, his voice high. "A fallen man and a homeless woman. You think your words hold weight here?" Adrian stared straight ahead, his eyes blazing. "Worth is not in status. It lies in truth. And the truth is backed by evidence." At that moment, the ballroom doors swung open. A group of financial inspectors and 2 police officers entered, holding files and recorders. The leader spoke in a grave tone. "We have received investigative documents from witness Evelyn Ward and have cross-checked them. The evidence confirms Richard Hale and Cordelia Hart's involvement in the fraud 4 years ago. The hall exploded with chatter. Cordelia stepped back, her face pale as paper. Richard growled, struggling to keep his composure. "This is defamation. I will sue." But the cold clink of handcuffs already rang out. An officer stepped forward and said calmly, "Mr. Richard Hale, Ms. Cordelia Hart, you are under arrest for fraud and obstruction of evidence." The metallic snap closed like the final curtain. The lights flashed relentlessly, capturing the moment false power collapsed. Adrian stood still, his breath heavy but steady. Evelyn remained beside him, her eyes shining not with victory, but with the relief that truth had finally been pulled out of the shadows. The ballroom, once prepared for a night of splendor, had become the stage of justice. And as the cuffs locked shut, an old chapter came to its close. The storm had passed, but its echoes still lingered. News of Cordelia Hart and Richard Hale's arrest spread quickly. The evening broadcast replayed the image of hands that once wore diamond rings, now bound in the cold click of steel cuffs. Public opinion buzzed. Some were shocked, and others were satisfied. But for Adrian, it was more than news. It was the final punctuation mark to the long days he had spent living in the shadows. He stepped out of the courthouse, the night breeze brushing past him, and for the first time, it no longer cut like a knife. Beside him, Evelyn walked with a calm demeanor, but her eyes glimmered with relief. They said nothing at that moment, letting silence speak, a silence filled with release. The next morning, in the small apartment, Adrian pulled open the curtains, letting the morning light flood in. The room, once accustomed to shadows, now overflowed with golden warmth. He turned to Evelyn and softly said, "You know, it's been a long time since the light didn't hurt my eyes." Evelyn smiled a true smile, not the bitter, guarded one she had worn for so long. "And it's been a long time since I felt like I didn't have to be alone." Her words fell gently, like a refreshing rain after a drought. Adrian sat beside her, his eyes bright with newfound hope. He no longer saw a homeless woman, nor merely a witness. He saw a companion, someone who had walked with him through old wounds to find light again. "Evelyn." Adrian's voice was steady, low, but firm. "I can't promise to erase the past, but I promise, from here on, we will walk forward together." Evelyn gave a slight nod. In her eyes, there was no longer doubt but acceptance, like two broken mirrors placed side by side. Not perfect, but reflecting a new light clearly. The city outside was still bustling, skyscrapers still gleaming like a play that never lowered its curtain, but Adrian and Evelyn had stepped out of their old roles. They were no longer the erased or the outsiders. They were proof that justice may be slow, but it is never silent forever, and that people, even after betrayal, can still find trust when they dare to share their wounds. At that moment, Adrian reached out with his hand. Evelyn took it without hesitation. In the light of dawn, their fingers intertwined a promise without words. The story closes here, but perhaps Adrian and Evelyn's journey has left you with many reflections. Have you ever faced betrayal, been misunderstood, or pushed aside? How did you find your way back to the light after the darkness? Share your own story in the comments below. Who knows, your experience may become the comfort and strength someone else needs as they fight their own battles. And if you feel this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to The Soft Why and share this video with your friends and loved ones. Every comment, every share is the motivation for us to continue telling healing stories that remind us that even after the storm, people can still find their sunrise.